Everyone to this week Semler Research Seminar, where we have the pleasure of receiving Stefan Schmitt-Grohé, who is a professor of economics in the Department of Economics at Columbia University. She is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research affiliate at the Center of Economic Policy Research in London. Before joining Columbia in 2008, she taught at Duke University, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and was a staff economist in the Division of Monetary Affairs at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in Washington. She has held visiting positions in the European Central Bank, Goethe University in Frankfurt, and Princeton University. Her research and writings have primarily focused on macroeconomic issues, in particular monetary and fiscal policy in the open and closed economy, and her work has been honored with the Bernasser Prize, which is awarded annually to the European economists under the age of 40, who has made an outstanding contribution in the fields of macroeconomics and finance. She is a native of Germany and received her doctorate in economics in 1994 from the University of Chicago. So today, Stephanie is going to be talking to us on the making of a great contraction with a liquidity trap and a jobless recovery that is a joint work with Martin Uribe, also a professor at Columbia University. Thank you very much, Stephanie.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. So this is joint work with Martin Uribe, and it is very much motivated by the current economic conditions. So let me explain to you what this long title means. In particular, let me start with explaining what we mean when we use the word a jobless recovery. So when we use the term, we mean what Bernanke defined it to be, namely output growth recovers. So that's important, and I'm going to spend a moment on explaining that. So output growth recovers, and the recovery is called jobless because the level of employment does not recover. The terms liquidity trap are less complicated, or I think less controversial. So what we mean by liquidity trap here is the situation in which the nominal interest rate is at its lower bound. In most central banks, that lower bound is 0. And the second aspect of a liquidity trap is that inflation is below target. Suppose you have a central bank who has an inflation target of 2%, like the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve in the United States, then inflation is below target if it is below 2%. So let me first go and explain what we mean by jobless growth recovery. So this is motivated by this quote by Bernanke. He said, given this weakness in the labor market, a natural question is whether we might be in for a so-called jobless recovery in which output is growing but employment fails to increase. Okay, so let me make really clear that we are all on the same point here. So I'm going to show you some data from the US. This picture is real GDP per capita in the United States from 1948 to 2014. This is quarterly data. And the thick line is the log of real GDP, and then the thin straight line is a linear trend. And then I have indicated in this picture 2 or 3 recessions, namely the big recessions of the early 80s. So that's 1980 Q1 to 1980 Q3, and then this was a double dip recession, so again 81 Q3 to 82, and then the more recent recession here, which is, let's see if I can move this, yeah, this recession. So why is recovery is the recession recovery. So if you really close to the screen, look at level of GDP see that even in the first recession, the level of GDP was below the trend line, and then it grew than average a picture by GDP coming level. Right? And then right away in 81 Q3 we the second recession, the ends and actually that and BR day makes perfect from this graph. The end of the session 1980 to Q4 because you see that grows, meaning it goes up, but it goes up at a slope bigger than the trend line, meaning we have more growth than normal. Us back to trend. I would this is what people consider a recovery. Output recover to the trend part. So now let's look at now I'm talking about the current recession, this one, what happens? We all know in 2007 Q4, the US economy goes into recession, output growth slows, and then here at this second point, 2009 Q2, this vertical line, is the official date when the recession ended. And you can see in this graph, this is when output growth stopped falling, and actually, I would argue output resumed growing. At what rate did it resume growing? More or less the rate it had over much of the post-war history. So the actual growth rate since the end of the recession was 1.2% per year. So this is per capita real GDP. If you look at data in the US since the 1990s, that's about average. Average was 1.3, so we're just slightly below average. If you look at data since, say, 1870, you go all the way back, average GDP per capita was growing at 1.5%. That's a little bit bigger, but not that different. So the point is that after the end of this recession, output resumed growing. So we see this here, output resumed growing, but it never came back to the trend path. This phenomenon is what we call a growth recovery, because growth resumes to a level about normal, but the level of GDP never returns, okay? So that's an important distinction for us. Okay, so I'm gonna argue that, or this paper is motivated by 4 data points if you want, maybe even, since some of them are half data points, a little bit less. But we want to argue that we have a couple of historical examples where we see this particular phenomenon we are interested in, namely a jobless growth recovery and a liquidity trap. So the 4 data points we have is the United States since 2008, Japan in the 90s, the Euro area since 2008, and then the United States in the Great Depression. So today I'm just going to show data for the first 3 episodes. Let's see whether those 3 episodes satisfy our definition of a jobless growth recovery and a liquidity trap. Let's start with the US, and I tell you which of the 4 criteria are met and which are not so well met. So this is in some sense the same picture we already looked at. We look at real GDP per capita growth, but now I'm not showing the log level. Instead, I'm showing the growth rate. What do we see? This is a 10-year window. Prior to 2007 Q4, GDP per capita was growing at somewhere between 1% and 2%. The recession comes. Not surprisingly, real GDP growth falls, becomes actually negative, quite a bit negative, almost minus 5% at year-over-year rates. And then comes 2009 Q2, the official end of the recession according to the NBR. And I don't think you have to be very sophisticated to understand why they date the end of the recession there. This picture makes it almost seem natural. If you had to pick a point for the trough of the recession, you would have picked 2009 Q2. So you see then output starts recovering. Output growth takes 1 or 2 quarters to become positive again. So according to our classification, this current recession was one in which the growth rate recovered to normal, about normal levels, like 1.2, 1.3%. What is special about this recovery, and why some people do not call this a recovery, is because real GDP per capita didn't grow at larger than normal rates, because there was no catch up to the old level, but there was at least recovery in the growth rates. Okay, so that we would say yes, the US fits perfectly criterion number 1, namely a growth recovery. What about criterion number 2, that the recovery was jobless? And this is our smoking gun, which motivates much of our work. So what I'm showing you here is the employment to population ratio in the United States, and this is how I look at it. It's basically a step function. Prior to the recession, employment was between 62 and 63%. The recession comes, employment falls a lot, and then here's the point where I'm interested in. This is 2009 Q2. We just saw in the other graph at that point, output started growing again. So the GDP per capita growth rate started becoming positive again, right? So what would we expect? What would a typical economic model tell you? At this very point, when GDP starts growing again, we should see that employment starts going up. Yeah, we want to see a movement like this. And we don't see that. So that's the point that made us stop. Instead, employment keeps falling for another 4 quarters and then pretty much has been stable now for 5 years at a level around 59% employment to population ratio. This is the reason why we say it's a jobless growth recovery. Employment kept falling and stayed low. It was never like a V that employment went back up to the original levels, okay? So that is why, yes, we say the US is a beautiful example of jobless growth recovery. Criterion 3 and 4 is the liquidity trap. The liquidity trap is normal rates at 0 and inflation below target. So let's see how the US does in that dimension. Rates are stuck at 0, we all know. As the recession came, the Fed started easing in, and by, I think this was December 2008 is the point in which nominal interest rates are were down at 0. And they have stayed there ever since. And what is the current policy debate about when they're gonna raise them? So our concern is there something special when an economy is in a recovery, in a growth recovery that is jobless and the normal interest rates are at 0? We would say the economy is in a liquidity trap, so we satisfy criterion number 3. What about 4? 4 is where the US is a little bit weak. So our criterion is to be in a liquidity trap, inflation has to be below target. What is the inflation target for the United States? 2%. So this is, let me move this cursor. So 2% is the target. Has it been below target? Yes. Has it been declining? Yes, but quantitatively is not that much below target. So inflation in the US is right now 1% below target. But I would still say, yes, it's a liquidity trap, normal interest rates are at 0, and inflation, because it has been falling, and because inflation is below the target of 2%, I would say, yes, the US is a data point for a jobless growth recovery with a liquidity trap. What about Japan? Japan also fits this pattern. What about recovery? Is there a growth recovery? Yes, in Japan, many people always think about, oh, in Japan, output is really low. But if you look at real GDP per capita and look at the growth rates, this is actually a strong recovery. Recession starts in 91, recession ends in 93, and look at this. GDP per capita is growing at rates in the recovery that is above 2% on average, which is for a mature economy like Japan, a very, is above average actually. So I would say there's a strong recovery in growth rates. It was a double dip recession, so recession, economy goes again into recession, so I'm not surprised that GDP per capita falls, but then the recession is called over here, and again there's clear recovery in the growth rates. Growth rates of GDP per capita again, post-recession are 2%. So clearly, Japan had a recovery in growth rates. So it satisfies the first criterion that we want to stress, namely a growth recovery. Did it have a jobless growth recovery? So here for Japan, I'm showing you the unemployment rate. And this, again, this is the moment I'm interested in. The economy is in recession. During the recession, unemployment rises, very little in fact, but it rises. That is not surprising. What is surprising to us, or which is the smoking gun, is this moment here. At that moment, we saw in the previous picture that GDP per capita growth became positive and went to levels at plus 2%. How can it be that in the same environment, employment doesn't recover, the unemployment rate increases? So that's for us the question we are intrigued about. Then this is a double dip recession. The economy goes again in recession, output growth slows again. There's no surprise here why unemployment increases. But again, the second point, we are really interested in what happens here. We saw in the previous picture that GDP per capita growth became again positive net 2%. Now our question is, why does this happen without any improvement in the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate stays high and close to 5%. We can look at the same picture in employment to population ratio, because that's what I showed for the US, and again the point would be here. This is the smoking gun for us. The recession is over, GDP per capita is growing at plus 2%, but employment to population ratio, which happens for Japan to be the mirror image of the unemployment rate, declines. So how come? We have recovery in growth rates, that is jobless. And the same is true. The second point we are really intrigued by is here. GDP per capita starts growing again, but employment continues to decline. Again, this is mirror image to what happens to unemployment. Unemployment, if anything, increases a little bit. Okay, so we would say we have two data points for for jobless recovery. Whether in a liquidity trap, I think that's for Japan not much debated. This shows the short-term nominal interest rate for Japan. When they went into the recession in 91, it was 8%. They eased, they got out of the first recession. Nominal interest rates are still 2%. They kept lowering them, and pretty much since 1995 until now, more or less, nominal interest rates have been at zero. So yes, they satisfy criterion 1 of a liquidity trap, zero nominal interest rates. Does Japan satisfy criterion number 2 of a liquidity trap, namely that the inflation rate is below target? Yes, that's very well known. This picture shows you the year-over-year growth rate of the GDP deflator in Japan. So what happened to this variable? We enter the recession, inflation becomes low. The moment we exit the recession, inflation is actually negative. They had an inflation target of 2%, they're clearly below it. And as most people know, inflation in Japan has been around zero or a little bit below that for the past 15 or 20 years. So yes, Japan satisfies the 4 criteria. A jobless growth recovery together with a very specific monetary policy environment, namely a zero nominal interest rate and inflation below target. What about data point number 3 is the euro area. We'll see to which extent it fits or doesn't fit. The first criterion is there growth recovery. So Europe goes into recession in 2008 Q1, is judged to go out actually in the same time as the US goes out, 2009 Q2. And looking at this graph, I think it's obvious why they picked that point. This is the trough for growth rates. Growth recovers, and growth is positive. It's actually very high in some senses. Close to 4% real GDP per capita is growing, so that's a very robust growth. They enter this second slump, and so it slows down. But overall, if you look at this period, GDP since the end of the 2009 Q2 recession, GDP per capita is growing at 1.5 or 1.2% per person. This is average normal GDP growth. So we would argue that also Europe, the euro area here, this is the series for the Euro 19 composite, we would say the growth rate recovered to levels that are consistent with long-run growth for a mature economy. What about employment in Europe? This is the unemployment rate prior to the recession. They fall into the recession, unemployment rate increases, and here this is our interest, this point. I just showed you in the previous graph that real GDP per capita started growing, positive numbers and maybe even values of about plus 4%. And this growth recovery happens together with no improvement whatsoever in the labor market. Actually, over this period here where GDP per capita grew about 1.5%, the unemployment rate went from 10 to 12% on average, so 1 or 2% more unemployment were added. So we will argue that also this is the case of a jobless growth recovery. Did this happen in the context of a liquidity trap? Yes. The Europeans were a little bit slow in lowering the policy rate. It only really hit zero now, but many people argue that the perceived lower bound was 1%. So I would my stylized view of this picture is, yes, they eased from 5% down to 1, which there was their perceived lower bound, and now they realize they actually can go to 0. So I would say the policymaker has given the maximum accommodation that the policymaker thought they could give. So also Europe is at a 0 rate. What about inflation in Europe? This is probably more people are aware of that because it made the news. It's a clear case of inflation below target. So this picture shows year-over-year growth rate in the Euro 19 area-wide inflation rate. Europe has a target for the inflation rate that says our inflation target is close to but a touch below 2%. So here I just draw a line of 2%. That's the inflation target. And what has been happening since the beginning of the recession? Inflation falls a lot. That's fine. But initially it looked like inflation would recover. But what has happened since 2009, inflation has been monotonically decreasing, and as was in the news, actually has been negative. As of 2015 Q1, Europe has very mild inflation. So I would say in Europe also what is going on is we have a jobless growth recovery with a liquidity trap and inflation below target. So those graphs set out the agenda for our paper. We want to know, is there just a coincidence, or is there something systematic that why is it that countries recover to the normal growth rates in an environment in which they are stuck at a liquidity trap and inflation is low? How can we understand that? Is there a model that can account for those four things happening at the same time? So what we do in this paper is we develop a theoretical model that can capture those four stylized facts, and our story is one that says when the central bank lowers the nominal interest rate, maybe initially they did that in response to some fundamental shocks, but if the nominal interest rate is lowered for a really long period of time, people start thinking, what is going to be the future of the economy? Is it likely that perhaps being at the zero nominal interest rate for a long time is the new permanent reality, or they assign, even if it's not perfect foresight, suppose they assign a very high probability to the economy remaining at the zero lower bound, and then they think, oh, if we are at the zero lower bound for a really long period of time, maybe we are also becoming like the one country everybody knows that has had this monetary policy, namely Japan, with 20 years of zero nominal interest rates. Maybe we're also going to become a country that has low inflation. So our confidence shock is one in which, because agents see for a long time a zero nominal interest rate, there's a switch in expectations. If you ask the agents in my economy, what do you think will be the long run nominal interest rate and what do you think will be the long run inflation rate, they will answer with a very high probability, we are going to be in the long run or for a long period of time at inflation below target and at the nominal interest rate near zero. So that's my trigger, this switch in confidence. And we're going to show that if there's a confidence shock, then we can explain the four elements we want to explain, namely a jobless growth recovery in combination with a liquidity trap and inflation below target. That's the first contribution of the paper. The second contribution of the paper is to show that if you have a liquidity trap that is not caused by a confidence shock, but is caused by a fundamental shock, what is the most commonly used fundamental shock to explain the liquidity trap in the related literature? Following Egerton and Woodford, everybody assumes that there's a negative natural shock, meaning a negative shock to the natural rate of interest. And what we show is that in these models, as soon as recovery begins, namely if there's a growth recovery, then it has to be job creating. So those models are unable to explain the joint occurrence of growth recovery plus joblessness. And then we have some comments about how to exit this the liquidity trap. That's the third part of the paper. So I just want to encourage you to ask questions if you want to. I mean, I think that livens up the platform, but I don't know if people... oh, I see you typed something. Yeah, you should just talk. Okay, so wait a second. Let me read what he said. Is this pattern of jobless recovery something we had observed regularly before? Could there be a story related to technology in which the recession gives flexibility to the economy to adopt less labor-intensive technologies? Okay, so of course, there's a literature on jobless recoveries, and some people, for example, Heimovich and Henry Sue, they have theories about that. What we would like to stress, Alberto, in response to your question, is that we think that this particular pattern of the joint occurrence of a zero nominal interest rate, inflation below target, and a job growth recovery is something specific, and that the other related theories about jobless recoveries, they are completely unrelated to monetary economics, right? And so these guys would have to say, oh, in the Great Depression, in Japan, this happened. So in this, if they have this idea of jobless recovery, their main problem is to say, why didn't we have this phenomenon in all the other recoveries in the post-war history? Our argument is going to be, oh, in the post-war history, this recession and recovery is the only one that took place in the context of a liquidity trap, right? So these other guys have the problem to say, why not, why are some recoveries jobless or not? Our answer is, we only see this particular type of jobless recovery when you're in a liquidity trap. But you know, there are many different theories. This is not exclusive. They are complementary, but our emphasis on this joint occurrence with a nominal phenomena. Okay, so I hope this answers the question. All right, so, okay, oh, you answered. Okay, but they might argue that it could be due to the speed of technology adoption. Yes, oh, that's an alternative one. I think the paper that pushes this the most, Heimovich and Henry Sue, I think they feel that their particular story of technology, when they take this to the data, works a little bit better for the early 90s than now. But yeah, it's a complementary story, and I haven't seen it really applied to this joint occurrence with zero nominal interest rates. Okay, so so how do we get our story to work? Our story, in some sense, is a very traditional, has traditional Keynesian elements. So our main friction is going to be downward nominal wage rigidity. And so we're going to be telling a story in which agents experience a switch in expectations, what they think will be the long-run inflation rate. And if everybody in our economy will have this confidence shocks that they expect the economy to fall into a liquidity trap because wages are downwardly rigid, at least in the transition to this liquidity trap, nominal wage growth is going to be too high in a sense that it will increase real wages beyond the full employment real wage, and then we will have involuntary unemployment. The reasons why we're going to have a liquidity trap equilibrium builds on earlier work that we did with Jesp and Habib, showing that in an economy with the Taylor type interest rate feedback rule, if you combine that with a zero lower bound on nominal interest rates, this economy has two steady state, a liquidity trap steady state and a target steady state. What is new in this paper relative to those of you who might have seen the earlier work we did with Ben Habib on the perils of Taylor rule is that here we can say something about unemployment. The other model had nothing to say about employment or involuntary unemployment. So the other model was mute on the stylized fact that motivated us to write this paper, namely the joint occurrence of jobless recovery in a liquidity trap. So that's sort of the new element. So how do we introduce downward nominal wage rigidity? We assume that W, that's the nominal wage rate here, is bounded And what's the bound? It has to be this function gamma of u, where u is unemployment, times the nominal wage rate in the previous period. So this is downward nominal wage rigidity because we only have an inequality in one direction. It's not a two-directional one. And this is the key friction here. So I'm going to spend like the next 10 minutes giving you some empirical evidence on downward nominal wage rigidity to convince people that this is a plausible friction. Let me explain what this gamma of ut is. So first you could think, oh, maybe this is a constant, make it in your head gamma of ut equal to 1, then this constraint would just say nominal wages can never decline. Suppose you make gamma 1.02, you might be thinking of a country like, I don't know, Brazil. They used to have a lot of nominal wage indexation, and then you would say nominal wages have to increase every year or every period by 3%. So one of the things we introduce here is that we make this wage rigidity parameter a function of the level of unemployment. And what we would like to capture is the idea that if unemployment becomes large in an economy, then it should be true that wages become more flexible. So that we don't just want to have a fixed rigidity, we think that if the economy is inundated with unemployment, it's reasonable to assume that wages become a little bit more flexible downward. So what I'll do now is I'll first give you some empirical evidence that there's downward nominal wage rigidity, and then I'm going to give you some evidence that it is reasonable to assume that wages become more flexible the larger is the rate of unemployment. Okay. So my first piece of evidence is from the US. This is data from surveys of people. They are interviewed every 4 months, and they are asked what happened to your nominal wage. There's hourly workers in there and salaried workers, and so this pertains to the hourly wage. This is a sample period between 1986 and 1993 where the US went into recession, and they asked these people what happened to your wage, and this is for the particular case if you take interviews that are 1 year apart. And what does this show? That there's an enormous mass at no nominal wage change. So a very large fraction of workers had no change in the nominal wage, and pretty much half of them, and pretty much the other half had an increase. So there is very little mass at decline, giving you a suggestion that it is really difficult to, or maybe there's a rigidity that prevents nominal hourly wages to fall. Okay, so this is the period 86 to 93 in the US. The same survey, this SIPP survey, where they ask people how much do you make an hour, but now used for a different period, for 1996 to 1999. And there's a paper by Gottschalk also, and Baratieri and Basso, and here what they tabulate is a density of nominal hourly wage changes. And so first of all, there is no big spike at 0, because this is just for the guys who did have a non-zero wage change. I assume that they didn't put the 0 mass in, because this probably would have been such a big spike here going all the way up here that would drown everything else. So these are only the people who did a non-zero wage change. And again, what do we see? There's a lot of mass to the right of 0, indicating that most people got an increase in nominal hourly wages, and almost nobody got a wage cut, or very few people got a wage cut, suggesting again a rigidity that increases in wages are possible, but decreases are much less frequently observed. This picture is also for the US, but look at the date. This is just from 2011. So this is really the period I'm interested in, because this is smack in the middle of the current recession, or in the aftermath of the current recession, when we are in this jobless growth recovery. This is from a different survey. It was by a paper by Daly, Hoban, and Luckin. And so they tabulate normal wage changes. So these guys have the 0 in there. So they say 17 or 16% of the people got an exact 0 change in hourly wages. And then these authors plot in there the normal distribution. Why? Because they want to tell you if it was sort of symmetric around zero, this is what it would look like. What do they show you? There's a lot of mass missing here. And it seems to be that maybe this mass is accumulated here. Again, this picture is used as evidence that there seems to be downward normal wage rigidity. All right. There's not only data for the US showing this, but there is, given that one of my data points is Japan, so there is data from Japan showing that there is downward wage rigidity in hourly female workers by Kuroda and Yamamoto. Then there is another very nice paper of downward normal wage rigidity by Fair and Goethe. They look at Switzerland in the 1990s. In the 1990s, Switzerland had inflation below normal. Inflation was between 0 and 1%, and Fair and Goethe show that in these circumstances, we did not observe any normal wage cuts, and they attribute the high unemployment observed in that period also to downward normal wage rigidity. Okay, so one other point from a different period of time that we want to also hope to make a data point of our study is this is the US in the 1930s. Is there any empirical evidence that there was downward normal wage rigidity? So what happened is that between 1929 and 1931, employment falls by 31%. So there's massive unemployment. So at that point, what does everybody, or what is the natural expectation should happen to wages? It should be that wages decline because there's such an excess supply of workers. Workers should be willing to work for lower wages, and that's how the labor market should clear. But this is actually not at all what happens. Normal wages only fell by 60 basis points during that period, but consumer prices fell by 6.6% per year. So if normal wages fall by 60 basis points, but consumer prices fall by 6.6%, that means that the real wage goes up. And that we can see very well in the next picture. So this picture shows you data from 1923 to 1935 for the United States, and it's a log scale. So you see that the solid line is the nominal hourly wage index, so it stays more or less constant, and then you see here the maximum cumulative decline by 1933 is 6%. But what happens to prices? We start in 1929, the cumulative decline in prices is 32%. So if you take the difference between 32 and 6, you get a 26% increase in real wages. And that is impressive because this happens in the context of massive unemployment. So why would wages increase in real terms by 30%? We take this as evidence of downward normal wage rigidity. That was just impossible for wages to decline by as much as prices. Okay, so that's some more evidence from the US from the Great Depression. And then let me show you just one more data point in support of the assumption of downward normal wage rigidity, also from the Great Depression, but this time from Europe. So this is based on a paper by Eichen, Green, and Sachs, and they have this following idea. They say most of the countries were on the gold standard, but some countries decided to leave gold early, and some countries decided to leave gold later. So we put all the countries into two bins. There's the sterling bloc that left gold early, beginning in 1931, which is the UK, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark. And then there's the gold bloc, which stayed on gold much longer, until, in the case of France, until 1935, so up to 4 years longer. And we are going to associate leaving gold early as basically devaluing and bringing about inflation, whereas staying on gold longer, sticking to a currency peg, and thus making high inflation impossible. So the question the next graph is going to answer is there any systematic difference in the economic experience between the guys who with England left gold early in 1931, or the guys who stuck to gold for a long time. And so look how this pans out to be. On the horizontal axis of this graph, we measure the real wage relative to 1929. So suppose you had 1.0. That means your real wage in 1935 is the same as in 1929. So the first thing that at least struck me when I saw this graph for the very first time, I would have thought that given that there was massive unemployment, there shouldn't have been that much of an increase in real wages. But as you can see, other than Finland, every single country had real wage increases. But do the real wage increases fall a little bit in line between whether you're a gold or a sterling block? The biggest wage increases are with the gold people, France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Italy. And the lowest wage increases are with the people who were with the sterling countries, the UK and all the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland. So these countries had lower real wages than the gold bloc. And also if we compare them on this dimension, 100 means you had the same industrial production in 1935 as in 1929. We actually see that these two groups bifurcate. The guys who stayed on gold long and had higher wages had lower output than in 1929, and the guys who, following England, left gold early, they had lower real wages and much higher real activity. They had than in 1929. So the way to interpret this picture again is evidence of downward normal wage rigidity, because the countries here in the lower block, they basically had fixed real wages because they were on gold. The countries in the upper block, on the sterling countries, they devalued, and such they were able to reduce the real value of their wage by the devaluation. Okay. So these are a couple of pictures trying to convince you that the assumption of downward normal wage rigidity is a compelling one. Let me go back now to the model after I justified why we introduced this assumption and some data supporting it. How do we model production? So we have two versions in the paper. The first one is very simple. Output, which we call YT, is produced with hours, H. We have a production function f of H, and this production function is assumed to be increasing and concave. And then in front, we have this xt. This plays a role, so why? What is this? xt is TFP. We assume it is deterministic, and it is growing at a rate mu, which is bigger than 1. So what do I think this is growing at? Maybe at 2% per year. And if I say there's going to be a growth recovery, I'm always going to be in a situation in which the economy is going back to this balanced growth path where consumption per person is going to be growing at the rate mu. Okay. Firms are going to be perfectly competitive, meaning they take the price, PT, at which they can sell their product, and WT, the normal wage rate at which they can hire workers as given. And so they're perfectly competitive, and they are maximizing profits, and the profit maximization condition, therefore, is that the value of the marginal product of labor, the nominal value, has to be equal to the nominal wage. So that's a pretty straightforward way. So if I show you graphically what type of labor demand there is, if I have hours worked or hours demanded by firms here, H, and I have the real wage, the normal wage, W, divided by PT here, I get a downward sloping labor demand schedule. Very standard one. And in this economy, firms are always going to be on this labor demand schedule. That means they're always going to hire the number of people they want. Sometimes they're going to hire this number of people, which might correspond to full employment. Maybe sometimes they hire fewer people, and then we have unemployment. But the firm in this setup is never forced to hire more or fewer people than they want to. They always hire the number of people they like to hire. Okay. Where does labor demand come from? Labor supply. Previous picture was labor demand. This is labor supply. They come from households. Households here supply labor inelastically. So the number of hours they get to work is less or equal to H bar, which is, say, 40 hours a week. That's how much they inelastically supply. So my household sometimes might end up just working 30 hours a week. So it's like, suppose you're a construction worker and your boss calls you and say, I have only work for you Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but I can't hire you Friday. Then there will be a case that maybe H is 32 hours a week and you wanted to work 40. Okay, that's the labor supply. I could complicate the model and make it endogenous. We don't think that changes much. Okay, since I'm talking about labor supply, let me also introduce the other elements of the household. This is a household that cares only about consumption. They have additive separate preferences, and then I have this thing in here. You might wonder what E to the psi t is. I want to contrast our hypothesis of a confidence shock to the standard argument in the literature. What is the standard argument in the literature? What drove the economy to the liquidity trap? It's the Egerton-Woodford argument that there was a negative natural interest rate shock. How is that modeled? As this e to the psi t shock. Okay, that's why we have it there. What's the budget constraint of the household? Price times consumption, so expenditures of consumption, plus savings BT in nominal bonds, plus taxes, has to be equal to labor income, the normal wage rate times hours, plus any returns on bonds. So what is big R? That's going to play a role here. Big R is the gross normal interest rate. So if big R is equal to 1, that means the normal interest rate is at 0. So big R is bounded below at 1, meaning the normal interest rate is bounded below at 0. B is the number of nominal bonds you bought last period, and phi is profits that you get from the ownership of the firms that we already introduced. Okay, so let's go back to look at equilibrium in the labor market in this model. This is my labor supply, just H bar. And then if I want to combine this, I would usually say this is labor demand. This is labor supply. How does the labor market clear? It clears at point A, where employment is H bar. So there's full employment. In my economy, this is not going to happen. What necessarily? Why? Because our restriction is not just that firms are on their labor demand schedule and that households are on their labor supply schedule, but on top of that, we have this restriction, that nominal wages have to be greater or equal to gamma times WT minus 1. So I have to add this restriction to my graph of equilibrium, and this is where this restriction is. So you might first say, oh, this should be just a restriction that the real wage, W over P, is greater or equal to some constant, so there should be a horizontal line here. Why is it not a horizontal line? Because we are having this assumption that as unemployment goes up, that is to say as H goes down, unemployment goes up, wages become a little bit more flexible. So this is not a straight horizontal line, but this is a little bit an upward sloping line. So what could go wrong here? Why could this economy not be at point A, but rather at point B, where we have involuntary unemployment? That would be a situation in which this PT here, the current price level, is too low, because it makes this lower bound, gamma times WT minus 1 over PT, it makes it too high. So if this lower bound is too high, the real wage is this value. At that real wage, firms only want to hire H bus number of people, but workers would like to work H bar hours. So the difference between H bus and H bar is involuntary unemployment. Suppose the price level would jump up. That would reduce this lower bound, and the economy could be brought back to point A. But we are interested in the case that something happens, that prices are not as high as people would like them to be, and thus the economy is at point B. Okay? So now we have to come up with a story why the price level is low. And the story we're going to tell why the price level is low is because the central bank, in an effort to try to stimulate the economy, has set the nominal interest rate at 0. And maybe they were thinking this would stimulate inflation, but it had exactly the opposite effect. It made, by the Fisher effect, it actually brought down the price level. And so this P is way too low, and therefore real wages are too high, and the economy is stuck at point B. All right. Okay. So I want to find a little bit more evidence for my assumption that the degree of downward wage rigidity becomes less so if unemployment is high. So wages become more flexible when there's high unemployment. I don't have much to show, but I just thought one interesting thing is to show some old evidence from Phillips. To be able to look at that, sorry, I need to show you one more equilibrium conditions in the labor market. So we had labor demand, labor supply, the lower bound, and then this is how we make the labor market clear. And it's important that you understand because that's sort of the heart of the model. This is a slackness condition, which says that if there's involuntary unemployment, that means if HT, the number of hours you work, is less than H bar, we go back to the example of the construction worker. If the construction worker can only work 30 hours a week, even though he would like to work 40, then for this slackness condition to be satisfied, it has to be, since this is not zero, this part has to be zero. What does this mean economically? It means that the lower bound on wages has to be binding. Okay? So if there's involuntary unemployment, if H is below H bar, then the wage constraint has to be binding. That's the slackness condition we impose. Alternatively, suppose the wage constraint isn't binding. Suppose the normal wage is strictly larger than this lower bound, gamma times WT minus 1. Then the slackness condition says there has to be full employment. Because our logic is if it was involuntary unemployment and the slackness condition was violated, then normal market forces would drive the normal wage down for the market to clear, and so this cannot be observed. So the slackness condition has to hold. What follows from that slackness condition? That follows whenever I see unemployment, my model tells me I actually know what normal wage inflation is, because if H is less than H bar, the lower bound has to be holding with equality, so this constraint holds with a strict equality. And I can use periods of unemployment to actually observe this function gamma of u. How? I just look at normal wage inflation, right? I put WT minus 1 here on the left-hand side, and I get that normal wage inflation is exactly equal to gamma of u. So maybe you can make in your head a graph of how this would look. Gamma, this is not binding when there's no unemployment, but then this constraint is binding if there's unemployment. So this basically, if you put unemployment here, wage inflation here, should be a vertical line here, and then something downward sloping. Is there any evidence for that? So let's go back to the classic paper of Phillips that gave name to the Phillips curve. So this is a paper published in the 1950s. And this is a graph taken from this paper. So look, this is a tabulation of observations from 1861 to 1957 of two variables. The unemployment rate in percent, so in terms of our model, this is UT. And here on the vertical axis, what we have is the normal wage rate. So this is in the notation of our paper, WT over WT minus 1 times 100. So this is wage inflation in percent. 0 would mean there's no wage inflation. 32 means 32% wage inflation per year, minus 26, wage deflation of 26%. So there are all these points between 1861 and 1957. And what is the stylized version of this graph? For me, the stylized version of this graph is, this is a vertical line here, meaning that when unemployment is 0, I can see any wage inflation rates between 2% and 32%. But if unemployment starts getting substantial, so above 2%, I have a downward sloping relationship, right? This is exactly our gamma of u function. Our gamma of u function would look like this, and then a vertical part. So we also take that as some evidence of wage declines becoming possible when there's high unemployment. All right. So how does our model work? When will we have involuntary unemployment in our model? Intuitively, we get involuntary unemployment if price growth is too low. In particular, if the lower bound on normal wages forces wage inflation to exceed price inflation by more than TFP growth. Just having wage growth to be a little bit bigger than price growth is not a problem in our model. Suppose wages grow at 2% and prices grow only at 1%, then we would say, oh yeah, real wages went up by 1%, but does this necessarily lead to real wages to be above the full employment level? No, because we have TFP growth. So this condition tells you this is normal wage growth at full employment. This is gamma over pi. And if this is bigger than TFP growth, then we get unemployment. So the inflation rate that solves this condition we call pi bar, and we say whenever we see inflation below this, we have involuntary unemployment. Okay. What's the second element here is the Taylor rule with a zero lower bound. Remember, this is the gross nominal interest rate, so R is always bigger than 1. How do we reflect that? We have this maximum operator, so it's the maximum between 1 and a Taylor rule. The Taylor rule has a constant, so this is maybe 1.06, the usual nominal interest rate, plus the Taylor coefficient alpha pi, that's bigger than 1, times the deviation of inflation from the inflation target. What's the inflation target? It's maybe something like 2%, and this is actual inflation. And then we also have feedback with respect to output. For the moment, we can ignore that, but later we will use it. It's not important whether you have output in here or not. Okay. Now I've shown you all the elements of the model, and I can show you my equilibrium. Why do I bother showing you all the equilibrium conditions? Because I want to show you the model is easy and simple, and so I can actually show them to you. Oh, I don't see any of my fractions here, but maybe you see them. Okay, so what do? This is a model that has long-run growth because I have TFP growth. So to have it in terms of stationary variables, I need to scale everything by xt. So little c is the scaled version of total consumption. Little wt is the scaled version of real wages. So I scale normal wages by the price and by x. And then this economy has pretty much all the equations you should be really familiar with. This one is an Euler equation which says the marginal utility of consumption is beta times R times the marginal utility of consumption next period. Here the fraction line is missing, divided by pt plus 1. So let's look at this equation and understand the usual logic of why central banks believe that by controlling the normal interest rate, they can control the level of current activity. Suppose we take the horizon to be long. So one period, I don't know, 3-4 years. What is true about the right-hand side? Well, in a world where expectations are well anchored, it should be true that the inflation rate in 3-4 years is the inflation target. So the policymaker cannot really influence this. And at that point, the economy is back at the steady state. So consumption is also given at that point. So the entire expected value here is given, so then we have that if the policymaker today moves the normal interest rate, so they move it up, the left-hand side has to go up, which means that consumption has to go down. So that's the usual logic. Tightening reduces aggregate demand, and vice versa. Easing means the right-hand side goes down, and therefore the left-hand side, if R goes down, the left-hand side has to go down. How can the left-hand side go down? Only if consumption goes up, right? That's the usual logic. What we are going to play with in this paper is that movements in the normal interest rate actually change your long-run expectations of inflation. Our argument is going to be that if a central bank keeps easing, and parks itself squarely at the zero lower bound, then that will trigger a change in expectations about the long-run normal interest rate. You're going to assume that you are in the liquidity trap in the long run instead of the inflation target of 2%. Okay, but one of the reasons I show it to you is there's nothing special here. We have the standard Euler equation. Second equation is the monetary policy rule, is the standard lower bound rule. So there's a 1 here because the normal interest rate, the gross normal interest rate cannot fall below 1. And then this is the Taylor rule part. What is this part? This is actual output. Again, the fraction line is missing, divided by full employment output, which is f of h bar. market clearing, consumption has to be equal to production, firms have to be on their labor demand schedule, and then here, households, there's no slavery here. Households can work less or equal to H bar. If you compare that, say, to new Keynesian models of wage stickiness, they don't have a condition like that. There it is assumed that you announce a wage rate, and then the firm can make you work more or less at that wage rate. We don't allow for that. We say you cannot be forced to come to work 45 hours if you don't want to. This is our lower bound on wages. And then we have our slackness condition, which says, again, if there's involuntary unemployment, that is to say, if HT is less than H bar, then the wage constraint has to be holding with equality. On the other hand, if the wage constraint is not holding with equality, then it must be true that I have full employment. Okay, so how am I going to get out of this fairly simple model the fact that if we have a contraction and then a recovery, the recovery is going to be jobless? Okay, let me show you how we are going to get a jobless recovery out of here. And first, we're going to show you that that economy has two steady states. So let's look at the steady states. We just look at the Euler equation in the steady state, which says steady state inflation has to be equal to beta times R, and the policy rule in steady state. So I can plug this here, and I get one equation in the steady state inflation rate. Okay. What do we all know? We know that one steady state better be the target inflation rate. So it better be true that if pi is equal to pi star, then we have a solution. But as we showed in an earlier paper of ours with Jess Ben Habib, the right-hand side of this equation is beta times R. The left-hand side is pi. How many intersections do I have? I have one intersection at the target steady state. That's what the entire New Keynesian literature studies, right? They have a 2% inflation target, and that's the only steady state they consider. And if you ask any agent in that economy, what do you think, where's the economy going to be 20 years from now, they all say, this is the steady state we're going to be at, an inflation rate of 2%. But one of the consequences of having a Taylor rule that is aggressive, meaning having an alpha pi bigger than 1, is that at some point the Taylor rule would ask for negative normal interest rates. That's not possible, so the Taylor rule has to become passive and a second steady state emerges. So one contribution of the paper is to ask, if I have these two steady states, namely one with a zero normal interest rate that R is equal to 1, and one in which R is equal to R star, are they both consistent with equilibrium in the labor market? And so one condition is going to be that at full employment, when U is equal to 0, this slackness condition is satisfied. And the other condition is going to be, is it going to be possible that real wages are constant in the liquidity trap? Or is it true that because prices are growing at a rate less than normal, maybe real wages are exploding and becoming bigger and bigger? So one of the things we prove is no, there are in fact two steady states. So there's a full employment steady state, and then there's an unemployment steady state. Let me make some comments about the unemployment steady state because it might not be so intuitive for most people. So what's going on in the unemployment steady state, it is true that the wage constraint is binding, but real wages are growing in that steady state. At what rate? They're going to be growing at the rate of the economy, which is mu, the rate of technological progress. So it's not a case in which unemployment is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger because real wages are becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. No, it's a situation in which there's a steady state, there's a certain value of real wages, and that one is growing at the balanced growth path at the rate mu. Okay, to show a little bit the dynamics, instead of, the paper is mainly theoretical, so we have mainly propositions, but let me show you a little bit the dynamics and get some intuition for them in a calibrated example. So we assume that the production function f of h is h to the alpha, and with a labor share of 75%. We assume C as utility function, so we have C to the 1 minus sigma over 1 minus sigma with a sigma of 2. What do we assume about technological progress? We assume that X grows at the rate 1.5% per year, and our time unit is a quarter, so we have 1.015 to the 1/4. We assume that the discount factor beta tilde is 4%, ex post, I think that was a bad choice because this will mean that in my liquidity trap, I have deflation of 4%. That doesn't have to be the case. I could have chosen a lower number for here. Many related papers actually assume a 1%, implying then that in the liquidity trap the deflation is 1%. But this is what it is. We assume 4%. We give the central bank an inflation target of 2%, again, because the time unit is a quarter, so this is 1.02 to the 1/4. And for the policy rule, we assume a Taylor coefficient on inflation of 1.5%, which is standard, and we assume a coefficient on output of 0.125, or 1/2 at annual data. Okay, so that's a standard. You might ask, the only interesting part here is how do you calibrate your wage rigidity function? So we have this gamma of u, which we assume is not constant, but is going down with unemployment. So here's what we pick. You can argue with that. We assume that gamma, when there's full employment, so if you make u equal to 0, then this gamma of 0 is gamma 1. What do we pick? We assume that at the target steady state, normal wages are increasing at 2%. In that equilibrium, or they can increase by, they must increase by 2%, but of course, since it's a downward wage rigidity, they can increase at much more. Is that a tight constraint? No, because in that steady state, what is going to be the normal wage growth? It's going to be inflation, which is 2%, plus TFP growth, which is 1.5%. So normal wages are going to be growing in that equilibrium at 3.5%. So having this lower bound of 2%, since 3.5 is bigger than 2, will never be binding. What do we do about gamma 2? This is what we say. We say that if unemployment increases by 5 percentage points, then you can cut wages, or you don't have to increase wages by 2%, but in fact, you can actually decrease them at 2% per year. So we say, what gamma 2 do we need to pick for that? And we get that the gamma 2 we need to pick for that is 0.19. Is this a very tight criterion, or do we make wages a touch more flexible than they are? I think we're actually making them a touch more flexible than what we at least saw in the United States. In the US between 2008 and 2010, unemployment rate went from 5 to 10%, but we did not observe any decline in nominal hourly wages. So in fact, they actually grew by 3%, which is different than what we are allowing for. Here we are saying, no, there's more flexibility, they could decline by 2%. So we think we are calibrating the economy in a really conservative way, in the sense that we are allowing for more wage flexibility or downward wage flexibility than we actually saw. Okay, so what type of dynamics happen? So before we go to the picture, what thought experiments am I making? For some reason, this is the shock that hits the economy. Agents think, if you ask me about the future, I suddenly think that we are going to become Japan. The normal interest rate is going to be 0. It's going to be 0 for a really long period of time. And I think we're going to move into a liquidity trap. So this is the picture. So it's like this. The guy wakes up in period 0, and he says, if you ask him, what do you think is the path of inflation? Going forward, he thinks inflation is going to fall gradually this way. And then my question is, if he has that expectation, what would he do to inflation today? And if he has that expectation, you can show that inflation today has to be less than the inflation target. And that is a rational expectations equilibrium, because the economy is going to converge slowly to this liquidity trap, which here happens to be at -4%. So why, if you expect inflation to be low in the long run, why would prices maybe fall already today? It's always a little bit hand waving, trying to give intuition for these self-fulfilling equilibria. Here's one version. You might like it, you might not. So I can tell the story and say they see this path of inflation is going down. They understand that they're going to be unemployed sooner or later, so there's going to be a decrease in demand or in period zero, and because there's lower demand today, prices have to fall. Here, the decline in prices, the way I drew it is really small, it's 10 basis points. So inflation, instead of being 2% per year, is 1.9%. So in expectation of higher unemployment in the future, demand today goes down, in equilibrium that results in lower prices. 10 basis points here. What happens because of the Taylor rule? The nominal interest rate also falls. It falls by how much? By 1.5 times 10 basis points. So that should be, goes to 5.85 basis points. What happens to output growth? Well, at the moment, since inflation is just a little bit lower, the wage constraint is not yet binding and the economy is at full employment. The economy is at full employment. What is GDP growth? Is the growth rate x of x, which is mu, which I chose to be 1.5%. So then the inflation keeps falling and falling and falling, and maybe you can see here's like a little kink. What is that point? That is the point when inflation is 0.5%. Why is that an important point? Because if inflation is 0.5%, the zero lower bound, gamma of 0, is 2%. So at this point, wage inflation exceeds price inflation by exactly TFP growth. If it is just a touch lower inflation than that, real wages will go up. And if real wages go up, this is this moment, then full employment is impossible. Real wages are simply too high to support full employment with a concave production function. I need to raise the marginal product of labor by having fewer people. So now we have that employment falls. But if employment falls, this shows up here as a decline in output growth because employment goes up. And then we can see initially employment is falling at an increasing rate until we hit this point here. And at that point, the decline in employment, employment is converging to a new permanently lower level, 5.5% unemployment. But once the speed at which employment falls slows down, we have a recovery. So we created what we set out to create. We have a recovery in GDP growth. So we have a growth recovery. And at the moment the growth recovery sets in, employment keeps falling. And this was the smoking gun we saw in the data, right? And this is what we want to do. Okay, in the data, so I'm reading Alberto's question. Okay, in the data, inflation returned to target as GDP recovered. What would be needed to capture that dynamic? Okay, so I would argue with that. So now I'm going to say no, this is not how I interpret the data. So I'm going to go back now, Alberto, to answer your question. So wait a second, I'm going to flip many, many slides. Let's see, I hope this doesn't make you dizzy. Let me go here. So this is let's go to the most beautiful case, which is Japan, and then we go to the US if you think I'm rigging the case. Look, this is inflation in Japan. They think they have an inflation target of 2, so inflation falls, and inflation sort of keeps falling. Okay? So inflation here doesn't return to target. That's my best inflation picture. Now let's go slightly worse. What about the US? Yes, the US doesn't have a monotonic pattern. You're right, Alberto, it increases, but then it falls. So I want to sort of generously interpret this as a gradual decline in inflation. So I'm capturing this part. What about Europe? Europe, I see you're typing, so I'll answer in a moment. But again, in Europe, here also, this is not a smooth pattern, but I generously want to interpret it as a pattern like this. Okay, okay, fair, so thanks. Let me go back. So that is what we set out to explain, and we think we can explain very well. And for those people who know our earlier paper on the perils, this is no way that this joint growth recovery together with jobless recovery is in that paper. Oh, Kolba asked a question. Let me read it. Do you have any intuition on what is in the labor market that is not present in the good market that creates downward wage rigidity? The first thing one thinks is union, but is there something else? Okay, I think that is a really good question. I think that the entire literature basically uses two models of downward wage rigidity. Downward wage rigidity, or the way we do it, both of them are not micro-founded. There's nothing in the model that explains why this exists. So my answer is going to be, I think the most compelling treatment I've seen of that is the book by Bewley, Why Firms Don't Lower Wages in a Recession. Oh, since I'm sitting in front of my book, let me see if I see it. Yeah. So what does he say? He basically says, I went in the 1991 recession in the United States. I met with 200 human resource managers, and I asked them, you were in difficulties, what did you do? Did you cut wages? And they all say, no, we don't cut wages. There's almost not a single. Truman Bewley took that as given, and then he tries to ask them questions that inform him about the theories.
There is
and
the
at the
chat
end
window,
of this long book, I think the story that emerges is that there's some moral thing that
microphone rights. So if you want to enable your microphone,
you cannot cut people's wages. There's somehow you cannot cut the wage of the new guys who come in, because then they would feel really, really bad, and they wouldn't work, and you wouldn't work as much as they should compared to the other people.
So if you have a microphone, Matthias, you can just press the microphone icon and you can talk directly.
He demonstrates that they don't even want to show their new employer their old wage. So people start lying and saying, when you are going for a job interview, and they ask you, how much did you make before? You give a wage rate that's like 20% below what you said, what you in reality made, just so that your boss doesn't think you get a wage that is below your previous wage, and thus you would have low morale in work. So that's the best answer I'm aware of.
Okay.
It's some morale thing. You might think that's a little bit a superficial answer, because why is there this morale issue? Okay. That's my best answer. But I think that's a very important topic, and I haven't seen people writing a theory about that. Okay. I didn't address your question why it is more so in wages than in prices. Just one comment about that, Kolber, is you remember the graph I showed you on the Great Depression in the US? You saw that prices fell by 30% and nominal wages fell by 6%. So comparatively, I would think, Kolber, that wages are more downwardly rigid than prices. Okay? So. Okay. One comment that you can make is that everything here relies, that the involuntary unemployment I have relies on real wages being above the full employment wage. Is that something that we see in these jobless growth recoveries? I've shown you that in the Great Depression, real wages grew a lot. What about in the US recession of 2008? Is it actually true that during this recession, real hourly wages grew? My model predicts a real wage increase, but pretty little. It goes from 0.75 to 0.76. You know, this is less than 1%. But yes, it's a very stylized model. So it is interesting to ask, is this something that we see, that real wages do increase in these liquidity traps with jobless growth recovery? For the US, I can show you some data in support of this. So what do I need to show? What did I do here? Well, I lost my arrow, but that's fine. So what do I want to show you? I want to ask the question, is it true that real wage growth outstripped TFP growth? Thank you. And yes, it is. So I go to the very nice data by John Fernald on TFP growth in the US. Shows you that between 2008 and 2011, TFP on average grew 65 basis points. And then I need to show you that Nominal wage growth was bigger than this, or real wage growth, and I can go to the data by daily, and they show that real wages grew by 1.1%. So there was more real wage growth, 1.1% per year, than TFP growth. So the effective real wage went up. And by how much? The difference, if you take 1.1 minus 0.65, so by 0.45%. So real wage growth was larger than TFP growth, which then has to lead to, given a concave production function, has to lead to involuntary unemployment. So at least for the US, I have some evidence in support that this small increase in the scaled real wage actually took place, and that lends support to my theory that why did we see this jobless growth recovery? The unemployment is caused by too high real wages. Okay. You might find the model very simple. It's on purpose like this. It's supposed to be elegant and easy to understand and lend itself to a graphical explanation. So more complicated. So
Stephanie, well,
Matthias, which is, we said, okay, is it really important that we had only one factor of production hours? What if we go to a more standard production function with capital and labor? In particular, one of the things that happens in our model is as there's this confidence shocks and people expect the economy to go to the liquidity trap.
No, it's fine. I was going to ask you that, well, Matthias was writing, if you can talk a little bit about the dynamic effects of fundamental shock under the exit strategy.
Capital, you might get there are some offsetting tendencies. So
yeah, at the very end you have these effects under an exit strategy. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about
we can prove that still two steady states exist. One steady state is the liquidity trap plus involuntary unemployment, and the other steady state is the target steady state. What is interesting now, at least I like that a lot. Now, in the liquidity trap steady state, the real interest rate has to be the same, always across the two steady states. So that means that the capital labor ratio has to be the same. And then what we can see is actually that we will get an equilibrium that as you approach the liquidity trap, you have a very slow recovery in investment, which is another stylized effect of the current recession. So what I do is I calibrate the economy and I solve for the exact perfect foresight path again. So again, we started at 6% normal interest rate. Why was it 6? Because we had a real rate of 4 and an inflation target of 2, so 4 plus 2 is 6. In period 0, the agents are hit by a confidence shock. Oh, I better speed up here, 4 more minutes. So, and they say, oh, I think we're going to go to the liquidity trap. Demand becomes weak, inflation falls, the normal interest rate falls. And here's this, what I described earlier. What happens in that case is that the real interest rate falls. Employment doesn't fall initially because inflation isn't low enough to hit the threshold. Once it hit the threshold here, notice that I chose to draw the variable in the level. So I'm plotting the log level now rather than the growth rate. And so you see this economy has exactly this behavior as we saw in the economy. There's a downward shift, and then we are growing almost in a parallel fashion because we are growing at the exogenous interest rate R. What happens to wages? Yes, real wages increase, but what is nice here, in the really long run, even though the wage constraint is binding, if you were an econometrician and you were observing this economy, you would say that the real wages are back to trend, right? And so it's not that real wages are ever too high. No, they return back to trend. To investment here. Woo! Why is that? Because initially, when the central bank is easing, they are successful in lowering the real interest rate, and that gives rise to an investment boom. But
so, if there is no further questions,
is higher,
I would like to thank you, Stephanie, for this talk. And
I think this might seem a little bit unrealistic. I think if we had put investment adjustment costs, we could have avoided the investment boom. But the part that is interesting for us is that if you look at data on investment, So one of the topics that people are writing about now with the liquidity trap, they are really obsessed is why is investment not going back to trend? And in our model, that's sort of very natural because employment is not going back to trend. We have this is a step function for the employment to population ratio that we saw in Japan and the US. If employment is lower, then the level of capital also it's growing over time, but of course, has a once down step, and so you don't ever have investment returning to the growth path, which is something we also see in the data. Okay, so I have like 4 minutes. Let me tell you. Let me just.
I would like to thank again our speaker today, Stephanie Schmitt-Grohé, for this very interesting presentation. And next week we'll have Neil Wallace from Penn State University, who will be talking about optimizing heterogeneity in monetary economies. The information of that seminar and the whole series is available in the seminar's web.